getting rid of free will isn't a drag, isn't grounds for society collapsing, isn't an awful despairing thing. It's wonderful news. It's liberating. Because historically, every time we have figured out how to subtract free will out of our view of the world working, it's become a more humane place.
Collective Insights is a voyage through topics and technologies revolutionizing human well-being. Groundbreaking approaches for a better world and a better life await you. Welcome to Collective Insights.
Hi, I'm Dr. Dan Stickler. Before we get into this week's episode, I wanted to share with you about a protocol I'm passionate about in my practice. Now, everyone wants to slow down aging, but most of us aren't sure how to do it the right way. And there's something that I recommend that everyone can do, and it takes just 2 days a month. It's a bodily cleanse that helps get rid of old defective cells, these cells we call senescent cells. They're shown to be related to so many symptoms of poor aging. This is something that all of us need to address as we age. This bodily cleanse is a supplement which contains a group of ingredients that we call senolytics. New research on aging and longevity, including a clinical study on Qualia senolytic, shows that senolytic supplementation can play a huge role in enhancing how we age. Senolytic ingredients help our body flush senescent cells, supporting repair and rejuvenation from muscles to joints to even how we feel every day. To learn more about senolytic research and to try Qualia senolytic risk-free for 100 days, go to qualialife.com/podcast offer and use the code podcast for an additional 15% off. Welcome to today's episode of Collective Insights. I'm Dr. Daniel Stickler, and I will be the host for today, hosting Dr. Robert Sapolsky. I'm so excited about this interview. I have read his stuff over the years and just love the work he does. He is the John A. and Cynthia Fry Gunn Professor of Biology, Neurology, and Neurosurgery at Stanford University. He is the author of a number of books, including his most recent, Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
I have to say, it's such an honor to be interviewing you because I found your work through Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers way back in the early 2000s, and I've been following your work ever since. But I have to say, when I got Determined, I cringed a little bit because
Good. Only
I felt like I had free will, but the more I read that, I'm not sure if I do. And it was a little existential crisis at first, but then it became more of a relief. So I would love to hear what really motivated you to decide to write this, because you had to know that it was going to really be impactful.
Okay, but after that, tell me what's been a relief about it for you.
The relief is that these things are going to happen. I don't have to debate too much on it. I don't have to ruminate on anything anymore. I mean, I still do some of that, but it's less of an issue for me.
Good. Well, I'm delighted it had that effect. That certainly is a much better outcome than with a lot of readers, as far as I've been able to tell. Why did I write this book? Basically, I thought I had written it about 5 years ago already. I had a book a few years back called Behave, The Biology of Humans at Their Best and Worst. And it takes people through the biology and environment and the interactions from what's going on in your brain a second ago to what went on in evolution as to what produces behavior. And I fully expected that anyone who read the book and made it to the end, it was god-awful long, or when I gave a talk about it, would come out the other end recognizing, well, there's no free will. There's absolutely no room for it. And instead, I'd hear from people who would say things like, wow, given all that interesting science you talked about, all of that, it seems like there may be reasons to question the free will concept, or at least parts of it. And I said, oh my God, I thought I was being unsubtle in this book. And I realized, okay, I need to come back and hit people over the head with this, and thus this unsubtle sequel.
But it certainly did that, at least from my perspective and the people I've talked to about it. And it also opened up a lot more questions for me the more I thought about it and the more I talked to people. I recently had Donald Hoffman on the show, and we talked about free will and how do you kind of reconcile this with his argument that consciousness is fundamental to reality and he feels like it exists outside of the space-time?
Well, I'm a meat and potatoes scientist and pretty hard-ass materialist along those lines. If you can show me how it works, I'd be delighted. In terms of where consciousness comes into free will, it's consciousness plays a role at times when we're making a decision. There's plenty of times where it doesn't, and that's one of the most interesting examples out there of where we don't have free will. I think I'm basically not equipped to talk about reality or what things might be outside of it. I'm good at pipetting things.
Yeah, I get that, and I've had discussions with a lot of materialists, and in the materialist framework, I mean, there's still a lot of unknown stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, I mean, how do you deal with that vast amount of unknown?
Well, my wife used to joke with me that she was waiting for the day that I would come home from the lab and say, "That's it. We're done. We figured out everything. We're all set now." No. And of course, dealing with the issue that like every time you answer a question in science, it generates 10 more new ones. And at least 2 of them are better than the initial question. But how do you deal with the unknown? All you can do is try to extrapolate and see where we were at, how long ago, and how we interpreted what we knew at the time. And to take a healthy dose of like embarrassment at all the ways that turned out to be utterly wrong, and just try to position yourself at any given moment and saying, based on what we know at the moment, that's the best you could do as a scientist, while absolutely keeping in reserve the possibility that tomorrow morning something comes along that falsifies everything you've ever believed in your heart.
Okay, well, let's go with some science then. So quantum mechanics. You have inherent indeterminacy. This is at the subatomic level, and things change there. So this indeterminacy could potentially introduce an element of unpredictability, could it not?
Actually, in the book, I devote 2 chapters to quantum indeterminacy, where my conclusion is it's like mysterious as hell and totally mesmerizing that turns out to be part of the universe, or at least my sense is not all, but by far the majority of physicists go with that interpretation. But it does not seem possible for it to have anything to do with free will, for at least 3 reasons. First one is this problem of bubbling up. You'd have to have these subatomic quantum effects bubble up a gazillion orders of magnitude, all of them happening at once, synchronized in the same direction, to make one molecule function in a significantly different way, let alone one neuron, one brain region, one person. So there's the bubbling up issue, the one that like every philosopher out there, whether or not they're compatibilists, there is free will, there isn't, that all of them are willing to admit, quantum indeterminacy is a good mechanism for generating randomness. And if somehow it bubbles up high enough to affect behavior, it would be random behavior. And that's not what we're looking for, either those of us who say there's no free will or the people who say that there is, because what is it that really like anchors us? And what's fascinating about the free will issue, it's giving us insight into our consistency, not our randomness, the way in which we are who we are in our bones, and we know who we are in any sort of, it's why at a funeral, like they always have the person's like oldest friend get up in order to say, even in kindergarten they were already like this. there was already that stability. Randomness won't do it. The third reason is what people reach for, and in my view is kind of a Hail Mary to solve the randomness problem, which is harnessing. And this is a word that's actually been used in that regard. At the upper level, your conscious level or unconscious, you can reach down and harness indeterminacy to get non-randomness out of it. And every mechanism out there by which we supposedly can willfully change what our subatomic particles are doing seems pretty dubious to me. And I actually know squat about physics, but it seems highly dubious to people who know tons about it. So I think quantum indeterminacy is totally cool and amazing. And it seems like Einstein was wrong that God does roll dice for a living at times, but that's not where we're getting the ability to choose whether or not to pull a trigger.
Okay. Well, I practice systems medicine, and I define the human system as a complex adaptive system. In that, you have to account for, or you can't account for, the new emergent properties that can occur in a system. Can that be classified as determinacy?
Oh, determinacy, but unpredictable, which is a real sticking point, which, in addition to quantum indeterminacy, the two most amazing, revolutionary things that's come out, in this case, in the last half century in science or so. One is chaos, chaoticism, nonlinear systems, and the other is emergent complexity. And I love them. I torture my students going on and on lectures about them because, for my money, what they show first off is little things can make a huge difference. The butterfly effect, sensitive dependence on initial conditions. And what that does is introduce formal unpredictability into all sorts of complicated stuff like us. And formal as in, we're not just waiting around to discover a more powerful magnifying glass and then we can really predict stuff. There's some things that are simply not predictable in the world, and that's beyond fascinating. And with emergent complexity, the fact that there are some things that emerge where you cannot predict them from the very simple constituent parts, but throw enough of them together and more is different. And out comes, as you said, incredibly beautiful, complex, adaptive sorts of things. And for my money, what's most exciting about that is it shows all sorts of complicated things, from ant colonies to our brains to societies. You don't need a blueprint. And to me, the most interesting implication of that, which I hammer into my students with ham-hocked unsubtlety, is if you don't need blueprints, you don't need blueprint makers. But in terms of whether emergence itself is a means by which you can get free will, it falls apart for a very simple reason. Emergence, at least from the world I come from, it's why one molecule of water can't have the property of wetness. But wetness is an emergent property of, a large collection of them. And an organized society is an emergent property of a whole bunch of ants. But one ant makes no sense at all. And the key thing in all of those, the thing that takes your breath away with emergence, is your starting state are these stupid little components, building blocks that just have a few rules for how they function and is function with how they interact with their immediate neighbors, and throw enough of them together and you're solving the traveling salesman problem and how your brain wires up fetally, and it's just stunning and totally amazing and all of that. But every model I've seen out there that then says once you have at the emergently complex level the means to have free will, every one of those models requires being able to once again harness, reach down, and somehow change the nature of those component parts, somehow make them smarter, somehow make them capable of doing things they didn't do before. And the amazing, breathtaking thing about emergence is you got something incredible like your brain or society, and the component parts are the same stupid little parts with the same small number of local rules. And that's the amazing thing of it. If all of a sudden your neurons learn how to speak French from out of nowhere, like, what's cool about that? Magic has happened. So the downward causality that is needed to pull free will out of either emergence or chaotic unpredictability or quantum determinacy is a type that simply doesn't exist. And if it did, it would like ruin the whole fun of the whole phenomenon in a sense.
I didn't realize that we didn't even really just give a basic explanation of determinacy. So could you give us something basic that is easily understood?
Yeah, maybe the best place to start is going through where I think people always like go off the rails and seeing, free will where it isn't, which is we make choices. Every day we make a gazillion choices. We sit there, we have to decide about something. We form an intent, we choose based on it. We know consciously that we're making that choice. We have a pretty good guess what the outcome's going to be. Most importantly, we know we don't have to do it. There's alternatives available to us. And for most people, just intuitively, that's it. That's necessary and sufficient to decide that you've just demonstrated free will. And that is truly a choice in the sense that in a world with chaotic unpredictability, the world's future was not determined at the Big Bang at any given moment. Absolutely, there are multiple possible futures there. But once whatever of those futures has happened, you will see where the determinisms come in. So how can we sit there and we form an intent and we choose? We have alternatives, all of that. How could that possibly still be a world in which we have no free will? Because focusing just on that is like trying to assess a book just by reading the last sentence of it, by reviewing a book based on that. Because what you're not doing is asking the only fundamental question that has to be asked, which is, so how do you wind up being the sort of person who would be in that place at that moment and have that option to make that choice, and who formed that intent? How'd that happen? How did everything that came before, from the moment you were like a fertilized egg, and actually even before that, how did all of that produce the you that is you, who would have that intent at that point and choose to take that action? And it's in that domain, these more distal causes, distal like as distant as 1 second ago to a million years ago, it's in that realm that free will dies, because all we are is the end product in that moment where we have a choice. All we are is the end product of the things that guaranteed we'd be the sort of person who would make that choice.
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas that kind of gave me a more solid grasp of it. Was it's not about saying, the entire timeline of the universe was already predestined at the Big Bang, but that all of everything that led up to this point where you make a decision has made it so that that decision would be made in this way and not any other way, based on all of the circumstances that got you to that point. Would that be correct?
Totally correct. And like, how did you wind up being the sort of person who would say what you just said? Implicit in that is, well, how'd you wind up getting born in a place where, like, instead of getting rickets or river blindness, you got an education? How'd you get interested in whatever you got interested in that led you to be here? Why'd you turn out to be the sort of person who is, like, intellectually engaging with strangers, et cetera, yeah. How did we get to where we are? And that's where we're nothing more or less than the end product of the biology over which we have no control, and its interactions with environment that we have no control over either.
Yeah, that's really the point where I started to embrace this, when I understood that. But I mean, how do you kind of talk about the subjective experience of thoughts and feelings in this regard?
Well, subjectivity is great. It can give us a warm, glowing feeling. It could make us form intensely strong emotion. But it's a very bad litmus test for reality. And subjectivity, intuition, time and time again, whether it's the subjectivity of deciding someone is guilty from the perspective of the jury box you're sitting in, when in fact they're innocent, or any version of that, or the intuition that it's wrong when people do this, but it's okay when they do that. All of those are subjective and based on intuition, and those are really bad guides for reality. And when you look at a lot of the most card-carrying serious philosophers out there who say, okay, yes, the world is made of stuff. There's atoms, there's neurons. Yes, it's a material world, but somehow, it's compatible with there still being free will. People who are compatibilist philosophers, when you look at what they're saying, often it just feels so intuitively obvious. It just feels so subjectively true that I just decided to say the word subjectively true. And they're getting gummed up in that. And some of the most visible of these folks, Daniel Dennett, for example, when you really cut through what he's saying it just feels like there is, and then parentheses, and it would be a real drag if it wasn't, and really unnerving. But subjectivity, intuition, we had very different intuitions at points in the past that we now recognize to be appalling. It's a bad guide to making those decisions.
What about qualia? That's always one that comes up.
Oh, God. Yeah. Oh, I don't know. I get all on very thin ice in this one. That's beyond my proletariat scientist's brain to try to take on. I usually excuse myself to go to the bathroom at that point when that comes up, but I'll resist doing that right now. That's the intangible stuff that's there, and we all experience intangible stuff. And it's boggling to think that could come down to nuts and bolts materialism underneath. That awe is made of the same stuff that wildebeest and asteroids are made of, that it's a material basis to it. But that's a realm that I feel very unequipped to have anything useful to say anything about.
Well, good. So there's a hope there, right?
Okay. A little daylight.
Why would we develop a illusion of free will? Or you like Sam Harrison say the illusion of free will is an illusion as well.
Right. Because the alternative is a drag. It's potentially depressing as hell. It's who wants to sit around and think about the undeniable reality that everybody who you know and love, someday their heart is going to stop beating. Yours is going to as well. The sun is going to implode or explode or whatever the sun's supposed to do. Reality is a real bummer at times. And in fact, a lot of this sort of interesting evolutionary biology thought has gone into the notion that if you're going to evolve to be a species as smart as we are, that could recognize certain realities and see them into the future, we had to evolve a stupendous capacity for self-deception in order to get up in the morning. And I think a very insightful way of reflecting on that is that there's a medical disease of people whose capacity for self-deception has pathologically collapsed. This is major depression. Major depression where people overall, when assessing the nature of the world, are, quote, sadder but wiser. Depression is a pathological inability to rationalize away reality at times, and reality could be a real bummer. So I think, we're a species that has come up with all sorts of improbable things that sustain us, and sometimes they do. And sometimes when the carpet is pulled out from underneath our feet, you turn out to be worse off than even before you started. But, among other things, a belief in free will for a certain subset of us is a very comforting thing.
And also it kind of goes along with my Buddhist philosophy of emptiness.
Yes.
In that sense, there are some major implications to a wide acceptance of determinism, and could just be the source of an entire societal collapse if you really adopt this. So what's with that?
What's with that? Good question. It took me 5 years to write this book, and I had most of it worked out in the first month and a half or so, and the rest of it was, oh God, is the punchline to this entire book, could it be, tough luck, this is reality, suck it up. And oh God, that's going to be pretty depressing. Before I had this sort of realization, and Sam Harris in lots of ways has emphasized this, and I thank him for that. If you really think about it, and you think about what a belief in free will means for most people out there, getting rid of free will isn't a drag, isn't grounds for society collapsing, isn't an awful, despairing thing. It's wonderful news. It's liberating. Because historically, every time we have figured out how to subtract free will out of our view of the world working, it's become a more humane place. Because for people like us, an absence of free will kind of means, well, maybe you don't deserve as much praise as you do for your reflective whatever, and the fact that you also can read and write. But for most people out there, the absence of free will means it wasn't your doing, and it wasn't your failure, and you couldn't have stopped that. And the odds were stacked against you. And no matter what society says, it doesn't really work that way, and you were a lost cause. And it's freeing. I mean, the greatest example I could think of is this monumental time that we subtracted a view of free will out of our notions about human nature, when we figured out that people do not have the free power to control the weather. And suddenly, if there was a horrible lightning storm that took out your crops and it's 1623, you don't go looking for the old lady living on the edge of the hamlet there and conclude that she was doing witchcraft. Oh, humans can't do that. And as such, it is not scientifically justifiable to say the solution to thunderstorms is to burn this old woman at the stake. That was a remarkably freeing thing. We don't have the power to do that. And in the years since, every time we have subtracted free will out of our view of how we work as biological organisms, it's become a nicer world. It's become more humane. So rather than the roof caving in, I think it would be a great thing.
What about people who commit the crimes of murder and are just pure hedonistic in that regard, and they can justify and say, well, it's predetermined.
Well, this is where people most reliably panic. Oh my God, even if there isn't free will, you shouldn't be telling people that, because everyone will run amok. That's the first version of it. And there's a whole really interesting science by now suggesting that people will not run amok when they have had a time to think about life without responsibility. But then they come back and say, well, what about the subset of people who were murderers? Are they just going to run around on the streets there? And no, not in the slightest. Just because someone who was damaged de facto to become that way, doesn't mean people should be damaged by them. You got to protect people from dangerous things. But what you wind up getting is, as a metaphor, a car whose brakes don't work anymore is absolutely dangerous. And it's like a catastrophe. It's on the street. You got to get it out. You lock it up in a garage. You don't drive it, but you don't go in every day and preach to it about how it has a rotten soul, and that's why its brakes don't work. And you also put effort into sort of root causes. Ooh, how do you fix brakes that don't work and get wise and efficacious about that? And you could sit there and say, oh God, so like dangerous people are like cars whose brakes don't work. That's so dehumanizing. That's so mechanistic. That's a hell of a lot better than sermonizing somebody into having a rotten soul. And the thing about it seems like such a radical idea. Oh no, instead of like punishment or things like that for our dangerous, viciously dangerous, remorselessly dangerous people in some case, we're just going to quarantine them like a car whose brakes don't work. That seems so inconceivable. And we do that all the time. All the time, we have a circumstance where somebody becomes dangerous to society, and we make it not possible anymore for them to be dangerous. We constrain them, and not an inch more than that, and without an inch of moralizing, and we do it so automatically we don't even notice it. Your kid has a runny nose, and you do a major constraint, preemptive, Tom Cruise Minority Report thing. You keep them home from kindergarten tomorrow because they say, please, if your kid has a nose cold, keep them home so they don't get everybody sick. You quarantine, you constrain your child, you keep him home that day to keep him from being damaging, and that's great, but you don't say to your kid, oh, you can't play with your toys today because justice needs to be served because of your runny nose. And if that seems like an absurd example, we're not that many centuries past the point where people had a whole lot of trouble telling the difference between health and moral goodness and illness as a sign of God's retribution stuff. And you just keep your kid home. Airline pilot, it's hay fever season. They get like they've got problems and they're taking antihistamines. And as a result, there's a preemptive, let's take free will out of this thing that you do. You say, oh, if you're a pilot and you're taking antihistamines and you're drowsy, you can't fly for 3 days afterward. Not because you have a rotten soul, but whatever's up with your immune system with hay fever. And we've done that. That's a realm where we have subtracted out free will out of a circumstance where you don't want pilots who are getting drowsy because they're dangerous. And we know how to do it. And the thing is, we know how to do it so easily in some realms, we can't even imagine that, keeping your kid home from pre-K is an instance where if that's what you do, but nothing more than that, nothing more constraining than that, you've just proven you have a 21st century mindset and you can view a nose cold outside the context of free will. Good for you. You run circles around somebody from 500 years ago. We can do it. We just got to keep doing it in more and more realms where at first it seems intuitively completely nutty. And we just got to get there and see that's the nature of how things work. And each time you do that, it's a really great world when people don't yell at their kids for having like runny noses. It's a more humane world when we get rid of free will.
So did they use you as a consultant on Free Guy, the movie?
Thank God I'm in too obscure of an ivory tower to be touched by like everyday cultures.
Yeah, the one thing you said was it can be very freeing, and that's what I experienced after the existential crisis. It was very freeing because I started realizing that everything that had led up to a point of a decision in my life had led up to that decision. And no matter how much I could debate it at that point, it was going to be the same decision. And I was like, wow, you don't have to even think about any of the decisions that you've made in the past and say, oh, I shouldn't have done that or I should have done this, because you would have made that same decision in those exact same circumstances every time.
Yeah. And it's freeing in ultimately an additional way, which is like if you really, really, really believe there's no free will, there's nothing more than our biology, environment, blah, 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 etc. Blame and punishment make no sense whatsoever. Keep your kid home from pre-K. Praise and reward and the meritocracies and all the rot with it make no sense either. a sense of entitlement, the sense that you have earned anything that makes your needs worthy of more consideration than anybody else's makes no sense. And among other things, when you put all those pieces together, hating somebody is like hating a coronavirus for being good at getting into lung cells. It's like for hating an earthquake. And, that's pretty freeing. I mean, I think we're seeing a version of that, a wonderful one. In the last month, there was that horrific mass shooting in Maine a couple of months ago. Like 18 people were killed from out of nowhere, no warning signs or whatever. And the neuropathology just came back on the autopsy on this guy, and he had massive, massive brain damage. This was a guy who had spent years as a grenade instructor in the military at West Point, in fact. And what he did is he spent all day long where here comes this newbie, and his job was to say, okay, here's a grenade, you do this, and now quick, throw it, and then it explodes. And so good going, okay, next. And the estimate is that over his career there, he was in close quarters of more than 10,000 grenade detonations. And the impact, the concussive forces there, what that does to neurons, that turned his brain into like yogurt. And you can already see some of the humane consequences of this is interviews with some of the family members of victims who say, that's why this happened. This was not this evil person. Why is it that the Pentagon doesn't realize this is a problem? But this was not an evil human who wanted to take this loved one from me. This was a massively neurologically impaired individual. And that's freeing, that I don't have to hate this guy anymore. He was a broken machine. I mean, none of them have used those words, but all of them have said something along the lines of, okay, that's why this happened. And that's a version of it being extremely freeing. I don't have to hate this guy. Vibration is very cool when a big truck is going by and you say, oh, that big truck is in vibration. Fascinating. When it's this massive vibration disintegrates living cells, and neurons are at the top of the list in terms of vulnerability of that. I mean, there's people, colleagues of mine, who make a living on vibratory damage to neurons. Yeah. And of course, the question at this point in terms of, so it's not this person's fault that they go off the rails. Didn't anybody think beforehand that this might not be a good thing for soldiers and other living things? But that's a whole other level of taking on this outcome.
There is an area that I feel that, and it can't be answered. Donald Hoffman touched on it too, in looking at consciousness as the basis of everything, and that we are in this relative reality, that we are projecting all objects that we're seeing, and that we still have this underlying consciousness that is the ultimate reality. And there can be some influence there, although, again, none of this is provable. But I do like the Eastern philosophies in that regard. I mean, they recognize the emptiness of things, which would go right along with the determinism argument. And really, it gives me that feeling like there is something that is beyond the relative reality that we're experiencing.
Well, I guess I'm just an old dead white male. I am not spiritual. I getting embarrassed wearing colorful clothes or something. My wife makes fun of me for this. I'm not cool in that regard. I'm a science thing, alternative realities and stuff. Maybe people didn't used to think things could fly in the air, and that got solved somewhere with balloons or gliders back when. But at least from the perspective of the nuts and bolts science that we know these days, I got a pretty Joe lunch bucket view of consciousness and what that could do. And from the standpoint of free will, the most amazing thing is when consciousness becomes completely irrelevant. I mean, like one of the most classic studies out there in social psych, you take people, put them in a room, and you ask like the volunteer, what's your favorite laundry detergent? And this classic finding that there's posters up on the wall and all of that, that if there's a poster of the ocean, people are more likely to say tide. And not only that, but when you ask them afterwards, oh, why do you like tide? They'll confabulate this completely fakakta explanation about how tide takes out the stains, but it's good for the environment, or it makes me smell good, or I like its taste, or whatever. And it's just post hoc conscious confabulation. And, we make conscious decisions, of course, and consciousness is a useful thing, especially like for neurological realms. But nonetheless, an awful lot of what we're doing shows that consciousness is often just along for the ride, or a post hoc explainer, confabulator.
Isn't that something William James kind of talked about with the, I ran because I was afraid of the lion. I was afraid of the lion, so I ran. But in the brain, it's actually, I ran, and then I was afraid of the lion as the justification.
Yeah, because you're getting the physiological response before you have time to form a conscious explanation of what you're doing. And part of what your brain is doing when it's deciding whether to run for your life or not is saying, well, so what's my heart rate like? What's my blood pressure like? Am I breathing so fast right now that I can gasp? Is my mouth getting dry? What messages am I getting from the outposts in my body that tell me how intensely I should be feeling whatever emotion I'm feeling right now? And that's spectacular. And this part of the brain is one of the most interesting, one of the most depressing things about like the working of the brain these days is, you look at something terrifying and it goes from your eyes to this part of your brain, to that part of your brain, to your visual cortex, which analyzes it, and this whole computational thing that's like dizzying, that it pulls it off, and it then lets another part of your cortex know what the whole thing looks like. And finally, like after an ice age, like a second and a half, your brain consciously says, oh, that's a lion that's running at me. And what's fascinating is there's a shortcut at the very first way station from your eyes to a part of the brain called the thalamus, a shortcut that goes straight into your emotional brain in under a tenth of a second. It knows there's something terrifying there about a second before you were consciously aware of what it is. And that's William James out the wazoo there. That's a totally amazing thing. And that's cool. That's like great that we evolved that we can get a 1 second jump on alarming things like that. But then you see stuff like you have people and put them in a brain scanner and you put up different people's faces. You flash up pictures of them and you flash up the face of someone who counts as a them, an out-group member, one of those scary people. And in under a tenth of a second, your amygdala has activated, telling your brain about fear and anxiety and preparation for aggression. And that is really bad news in that one, because you've made a decision, and like some researchers have even done this with police officers, showing you got a split second to make a decision. Are you looking at a cell phone or a handgun? And the sort of person who you're looking at is going to influence what your amygdala does in under a second. And whoa, we sure know how that one can go tragically. So yeah, the body is given all sorts of signals there, and some of the time that could be very helpful, and some of the time the fact that there's implicit stuff happening shaping our consciousness can lead to pretty bad outcomes. But consciousness is just sitting there. Some of the time it's the bottleneck as to what comes out the other end, and some of the time it's just along for the ride.
So are people who believe in free will like non-player characters that are neurodivergent?
They're like 95% of the population. They're more than 90% of like official philosophers who have the secret handshake or whatever. Polls have shown this. More than 90% of philosophers are compatibilists, saying, yeah, the world's made of stuff and there's still free will. Yeah, overwhelmingly people believe this. And I recognize that I'm not just saying there's much less free will than we think there is, and there's so much less that we've got to rethink criminal justice. I don't think there's any whatsoever, even among people who think about this and reach the sort of determinist conclusions. I'm out in the lunatic fringe on that one, because I simply don't see any room in which anyone could come up with an explanation for how we know the world to work that could make a crack between your ancestral culture and your genes and your fetal environment and your childhood and what your hormones were doing yesterday and what you're feeling like 2 minutes ago and the color of your socks and what your brain just did. And all those pieces together, no one can show a mechanism by which all that can go into making you who you are. And yet you at this moment can do something that's completely free of your history. That is, an uncaused cause. And yeah, for most people out there, not only is it unpalatable that there's a lot less free will out there, it is absolutely lunatic fringe, the argument that there's no free will at all. Nonetheless, this is kind of what I've gotten to. That said, and with all the factoids I can pile on at that point supporting that, about once every 2 months, I can actually function that way for about a second and a half, where I truly, truly believe hatred is never justified, that I am entitled to nothing, that, it's incredibly tough, but all we can do is look at every time we figured out it doesn't make sense to burn old ladies at the stake. It was worth the hard work to go from it being intuitively obvious that people could control the weather to being intuitively obvious that that's medieval, and, we got to do the work at it.
Well, I will continue, and I'm glad I am predetermined to have the philosophy of everything is empty and bliss is the object of emptiness, and I will remain in bliss and not fall to the depressive thought of materialism.
Take the path of that one, because not to delve into your world too much because I'm beyond ignorant, but when you follow through all these implications and no free will, and you've earned nothing, you're unselfing. You're deciding that you are not the center of the universe and there's nothing special about you, and there's no realm in which you deserve to cut into the front of the line.
And I'll leave you with the quote, Mahasukho, great bliss.
Thank you. You as well.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease, or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional, herbal, or homeopathic supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guests' qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.